There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to your Blue Mountains Alumni Speaker Series. I'm Ben Salter, I'm an alumni board member. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land from where I speak today, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past and present and their emerging leaders. Tonight marks a return to our popular guest speaker series, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I would ask you all to keep yourself on mute, and if there is a thought you'd like to explore, please add your questions to the chat box and I'll moderate towards the end of today's session. So now on with the show. By the end of today's webinar, half the population of Australia will be in hard lockdown again. And our topic of change has never been more appropriate. It's been a challenging year for most, whether you're still in the industry or you're not. And we've all had to deal with change, and understanding how we respond to change is really important. Today, we're joined by Dr. Kelly Yates, Head of Delivery, Research and Innovation at Trevor Roberts. And Dr. Yates is a PhD in organisational psychology and works with organisations to develop capabilities, performance and engagement of their people. My involvement with Trevor Roberts has been through as one of those companies that they work with my employer. So Kelly, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today and turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Bear with me 1 second while I share my screen. And thank you very much for the introduction. It's much appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the session. It's lovely to be here with you this afternoon. So when I was talking with Ben about this presentation a little while ago, he described the last 18 months as diabolical for hospitality. And I was struck by the choice of words, but also by how apt that description was for what's been going on over this last little while for everybody. So we are talking about a period of, a lengthy now period of time of rolling change and rolling uncertainty, with people being displaced and some people finding themselves in a position of doing something that they've never done before or never necessarily signed up for. And some of these changes actually have been significant enough for people to be questioning their sense of who they are and their sense of how they would like their careers to unfold from here. So it's a very significant time and a set of significant challenges that people have been navigating for a while. And with no end in sight really to this rolling change and uncertainty, I'm sure that there've been moments where you've had good reason to sort of wonder, well, how much change can I really expect to deal with at any one time? And goodness knows I would be thinking that if I was in your shoes as well. And so what I thought I would do with this presentation this afternoon is actually explore that question in a little bit more detail, that question being how much change can we be asked to deal with effectively at any one time? And the reason I wanted to look at that question, is because the answer I think is both interesting and important. And it's a little bit of a double-barreled answer. So let's take a look at that. Oops. So on the one hand, the answer is 100%, right? 100% you can do this, you've got this, you are well resourced for this change and the next one and the one after. But the second part of that answer is it's not necessarily going to feel that way. So change can be quite challenging for people, and there's some specific features of change that make it that way. And in fact, change at times can even be quite painful for people. So on the one hand, we're quite capable of it. On the other, we're unlikely to enjoy it. And I think understanding both of those sides of the equation can be important and useful. So on the one hand, understanding humans' incredible capacity for change can be helpful in terms of providing a sense of hope and confidence as you're facing this period of change and what's to come next. And it can give you a sense that this will be okay, that you do have the resources you need. On the other hand, though, understanding the ways in which change can be challenging and what those features of change are that are challenging for people can also be useful in terms of understanding where those reactions and responses are coming from, but also what you can do to make the process a little bit easier for yourself and for some people around you as well. So that's what I want to do with you this afternoon. I want to have a look at and tell you a story actually about humans' capacity for change and just how big that can be. Then I want to have a look at the specific features or change of some of them anyway, specific features of change that can make it challenging for people. And as we do that, pull out some of the strategies that you can use that could make this time of change a little bit easier for yourself and for others. As we go through the conversation today, I want to take a little bit of a neuroscience lens and sort of look at change from the perspective of the brain. The reason I want to do that is there's some, I think, interesting research, but also research that sheds a little bit of a useful perspective on change and how you can manage that change. So if we look at change from the perspective of the brain, very often what this means is developing new neural pathways. So when something changes around us, there's a change in our environment and we need to adapt to that change. Usually what that means is we need to do something different, behave in a way that we didn't used to before. And what the brain does to support that new behavior is it builds new neural pathways. So what this means then is the question, how much change can humans be asked to deal with at any one point in time, becomes how capable are humans of building these new neural pathways? What does that look like? And how can we facilitate that? So that question in and of itself is actually quite interesting. And the reason for that is when I was at university, which is not that long ago, wee while now, but not really that long ago, I was taught that adults particularly aren't very good at this. So we've known for a while that children's brains are quite plastic. So children seem to effortlessly and almost at will build new neural pathways and new neural connections. And in fact, that is kind of what they do for the first 20 years of their life. They go around building this enormous number of neural connections and pathways as they learn about their worlds and themselves. Then at some point in our 20s, we go through this process of mass neural pruning, where a whole pile of neural connections die off and fade away. These are the ones we don't use as often. They die off and fade away. And so we emerge from this process into adulthood with a much reduced number of connections than what we had when we were a child. This led to the belief that the adult brain at that point has become quite fixed. And as a result of that, I was taught things like adults learn in a way that's fundamentally different to how children learn, and that they find the process to be much more difficult than what children do. I was also taught things like IQ, personality, core characteristics of who we are tend not to change all that much. And that if we sustain brain damage in adulthood, it's pretty well permanent and there's really not much we can do to help people. This sort of story is similar to the story that we tell about change, and particularly change in organisations. We tend to say that humans are fundamentally resistant to change, they don't really like it, they can't really do it, and the majority of organisational change efforts are doomed to failure. On the flip side of this, though, on the other hand, is the story that I want to tell you, and that story is about my uncle, Paul. So Uncle Paul is actually not the fellow that's on the slide for you this afternoon. He would say that he's much more handsome, which gives you an insight into Uncle Paul's sense of humour. But when I was a baby, Uncle Paul was in his 20s and he was a police officer. He was transporting some evidence to court and he was attacked along the way and the evidence was stolen. In the attack, Uncle Paul was hit over the head with a crowbar. And this resulted in him losing his hearing completely on one side. There's a piece of his skull that was removed to let the swelling subside in his brain, and he sustained some brain damage. That brain damage left him without a sense of balance. So for a little while, Uncle Paul was able to kind of make do with a walking stick. He could sort of get around, but he would fall down a lot. And he certainly couldn't do anything at any kind of height. So an ordinary looking sort of door stoop was a pretty significant risk for him. The more significant impact, though, was that there was a pretty big drop in his quality of life following this accident. So Uncle Paul's experience since the accident has been of a world that will perpetually spin around him. It's just continually moving. And so this leaves him feeling very dizzy, very nauseous, very disoriented all the time. It makes it really difficult for him to be able to sense where his body is in space. And so for him, there's no clear up, down, left or right. He sort of doesn't really know where he is. His condition also continued to worsen over the next little while until eventually he was confined to a wheelchair. And that's pretty well where he remained for the next 25 or so years. So if we fast forward those 25 years, it takes us to my other uncle's 50th birthday party. And at this party, Uncle Paul wheeled over to me in his wheelchair full of excitement and pressed Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, into my hands. The first chapter of that book tells the story of a lady with the same sort of condition as my uncle. And more importantly, it tells the story of her cure. So my uncle was very excitedly telling me that he had taken all of his life savings and he was going to fly to Canada to get himself that cure, which is what he did. He flew to Canada. He was there for a total of 3 weeks, and 2 weeks of that time he spent in some fairly intensive treatment. That treatment involved a plate that Uncle Paul would wear on his tongue, and the plate had some electrodes on the bottom of it. The role of the plate was to sense the position of Uncle Paul's head in space and to transmit that information to his tongue through electrical impulses. To my uncle, that felt like champagne bubbles rolling across his tongue as he moved around in space. So he spent 2 weeks practicing how to use this plate, and then he flew back to Australia, landed just in time for my sister's engagement party. And he spent that engagement party on his feet, walking around unaided. There was no walking stick, no wheelchair, no assistance of any kind. He was also able to dance with his daughter for the first time in her life at that party. She was crying because it was the first time that she ever knew how tall he was. So what was happening for my uncle, and what on earth does it have to do with the change that you're experiencing at the moment? My uncle, the plate facilitated this process that resulted in a significant change in the structure of his brain and function of his brain. What he was able to do through using this plate is actually recruit areas of his brain that normally had nothing to do with his sense of balance and get them to take over that job from the areas of his brain that had been damaged in the attack, and so replace the function of this sense of balance. The other interesting thing about this treatment is that over time, he doesn't need the plate anymore. And there was always this quite long hangover effect. So he'd use the plate for a couple of hours and get sort of a full day of balance out of it. And then that hangover effect continued to increase until he didn't need the plate anymore. And this is because he's permanently rewiring the functions of his brain so that they can take over the function that was lost in the attack. This is, from a neuroscience perspective, a huge and significant change, and something that I had been taught was absolutely impossible to achieve. The broader neuroscience research has gone on to develop treatments for a range of conditions that are, equally amazing, for things like stroke, some forms of blindness, learning disabilities, symptoms of Parkinson's, and even OCD. Taken together, this body of research starts to show us that we're far more capable of change, and really significant change, far more capable of that than we ever gave ourselves credit for. And if you keep in mind that my uncle managed to achieve this change within just 2 weeks of intensive treatment, it also starts to show us the pace at which we can achieve really significant change. Which is not surprising when you think about the fact that the continued survival and evolution of our species is dependent on our ability to adapt to an environment that changes continuously around us. When you think about it from that perspective, it kind of makes sense that we would have developed a brain that is able to change and facilitate this adaptation along with us. And so I guess the message out of that is, yes, you do have the resources that you need to deal with this change and the next one and the one after that. And in fact, more resources than perhaps you give yourself credit for. And yet, at the same time, my hairdresser just a few weeks ago asked me to style my hair differently, and I dead set still feel like my arm's been cut off. And so we have this incredible capacity for change, and yet our experience of it is one of challenge and difficulty. So let me have a look and talk with you now about what happens and some of these features of change that can make it challenging, as well as some of the things that you can do to make it just a little bit easier. So the first feature I want to touch on is that change can be quite fatiguing. And so where this comes from is neuroplastic change, particularly the change my uncle achieved, is facilitated and only occurs after the application of considerable conscious attention and effort. So what I mean by this is, if Uncle Paul had popped that plate on his tongue and kind of wandered around and not really paid attention to what he was doing, nothing would have happened. He needed to invest a significant amount of effort and conscious attention in interpreting that signal and figuring out what that signal meant in terms of his balance and the orientation of his body in space. If you ask him about those 2 weeks while he was over there doing this, he will describe them as some of the toughest weeks of his life. And he'll tell you that there were numerous times when he desperately wanted to get back on a plane and fly home to Australia because it was so difficult. We find this is true of all neuroplastic change, that it requires a significant amount of effort and conscious attention on part of the person that's doing the change. In fact, the relationship between effort and change is neat enough that we can predict the amount of change that somebody will achieve by measuring how much effort they're putting in. The more effort they put in, the bigger the change. And so what this means is that sustained effort, that sustained conscious attention is a necessary part of the change process. So what I want to do now is take a sort of more mundane, everyday example of change that might be a bit more relatable, and unpack where this sense of effort comes from, as well as have a look at why it can be so fatiguing for people. So the example I want to take is one that's come up a lot with some of the client organisations I've been working with over the last 12 months. I've got a lot of client organisations who, as a result of some of the experiences through COVID, have decided to implement flexible working policies, which seems like on the surface of it a reasonably straightforward sort of change. You know, there's some complexity around working out what the rules will be, how many days, and what happens for part-timers, and you know, what happens if someone's sick, and etc., who's going to answer phones and so on. But once all of that detail is sorted out and you've got the policy, the change itself seems reasonably straightforward. However, the policy is a little bit like the plate in my uncle's story. It provides a path to run down and a mechanism to help facilitate the change, but in and of itself is insufficient to make the change occur. For a flexible workplace policy to be enacted and to be successful, what that actually means is that every individual who's impacted by that policy has to think through how they're going to do this. They have to create a workstation at home and one at work that has all of the resources that they need. They have to work out how they're going to get the information that they would normally get from you know, hallway conversations or meetings or documents that they don't necessarily want to transport between the two locations anymore. If there's a resource that can't be duplicated, like my laptop, for instance, they then need to build a new routine and habit around transporting that resource between the two workstations. And sometimes there's changes to their getting ready for work routine because the time has changed, and their finishing work routine as well. So what seems on the surface to be a fairly simple and straightforward sort of change actually brings with it a whole bunch of individual changes in behaviour that the person needs to implement. Let me show you and talk with you a little bit about what's happening neurologically when that's going on. So the first thing I want to say is the brain is a very energy hungry piece of equipment. So if you compare the brain as an organ to the other organs in our body, what we find is that it uses a disproportionate amount of resources, so blood, glucose, oxygen, compared to the other organs. And how we kind of balance that out is the brain prefers to operate on autopilot wherever possible. So what happens when we're learning a new behavior, task, or activity is we do this consciously. We need our conscious attention over the top of that activity to make sure we're on the right track, coming up with the best strategy, course correcting and responding to errors where we need to. But eventually we'll get to a point where we've worked out what the best approach is and we're able to kind of repeat the behavior over and over again. Once that happens, we've established this new neural pathway and the brain will hand that over to the subconscious processing centers, if you like. These subconscious processing centers use less energy. And so now the brain is able to, without conscious attention, without a lot of energy and effort, just trigger the pattern of behavior, trigger the recipe, and we just repeat the behavior over and over. This is called a habit, by the way. When we experience a change, things that are habits, things that we've done a million times before and is happening effortlessly at the moment, suddenly need to change. And so they need to be pulled back up into those conscious processing centers, which uses more energy. And so suddenly we've got this step change in the amount of effort that we're investing just in ordinary day-to-day activities, things that we used to do without thinking too much about it. If you keep in mind that a single change, a single simple change, working from home a couple of days a week, for instance, brings with it multiple changes in behavior, you've suddenly got multiple things that you're now processing consciously using more energy and effort than what you used to do before. If this change happens to occur at a time when you've got multiple changes going on, like in a pandemic, or you're already busy or under pressure or already learning new things, then you can see that very quickly the amount of resources we're using grows exponentially, can get very crowded very quickly in these conscious processing centers. And suddenly we find ourselves in a position where inexplicably just our daily routine has become hard and we don't really know why. The other comment I'll make at this point is when we're learning something new, things go wrong. We'll make a mistake because we haven't practiced it yet, we're still learning, or unexpected things happen. If it's a change process, things might continue to change around us. When that happens, when we make a mistake or we don't get the outcome we're looking for, something unexpected occurs, this will generate an error signal in our brain. These error signals will draw resources away from the prefrontal cortex and activate the amygdala. For those of you who've heard of the amygdala hijack, you're probably going, that sounds familiar, because that's what happens in an amygdala hijack, and you'd be right. For those of you who haven't heard of the amygdala hijack, all you need to know at this point is that this process, the activation of the amygdala, feels like stress for us. And so as these error signals are being generated, it adds a sense of urgency and a sense of stress and distress to a process that is already quite effortful. So what can we do, having understood that? What can we do to make things just a little bit easier for us when we're managing change? The first one is to manage fatigue and manage your brain's energy levels as it's undertaking this learning and this process of building new habits. There's 3 key things from the research I want to highlight for you that are particularly good for your brain while it's doing this learning. The first is getting enough sleep. So getting enough sleep is beneficial for a whole host of reasons, but in this particular context, it also facilitates learning. So when we're asleep, the brain is actually going through this process of consolidating memories and consolidating learning from the day before. So if you're in a change process and you're trying to build new habits, new routines, learn new tasks or activities, getting enough sleep is a really important way of giving your brain the time and space it needs to consolidate that learning and facilitate that process. Walking is similar in terms of facilitating the brain's process. And again, all exercise is beneficial for a whole host of reasons, but walking in particular, and in particular, walking long distance or walking in areas that are unfamiliar, so you have to do a little bit of navigating, has been shown to promote neurogenesis, which is that process of building new neural connections. So it can be really helpful in terms of facilitating that learning as well. The last point there on nature refers to some new research that's emerging that shows that natural environments use our brain's resources differently than urban environments. And so when we're in a natural environment, what we find is that these environments use less resources, less conscious processing, less attention, less energy, whereas an urban environment uses more. And so a natural environment provides a context in which our brain can truly rest and relax and just tune out for a bit. So the trifecta, of course, would be taking a hike in a natural environment followed by a good night's sleep. The second point there is around building and maintaining your motivation. So all change, including change that's positive and chosen by us, gets to a point where it just becomes a grind, where it just gets hard. And that's the point at which we're thick in the business of doing this learning, thick in the business of establishing these new habits, learning new ways of operating, trying to embed this down and get it to a point where it can be automated. Once we get to that point, it can be really helpful if we're able to do some stuff to boost our motivation once it gets hard, right? And one of the ways that we can do that is to be clear on the what's in it for us, be clear on the benefit that we will get out of this effort. Now, you sometimes need to think a bit creatively, particularly in situations where that change is being imposed on you. You don't necessarily agree with it, you haven't chosen it. See if you can find something in the context of that change and in the context of all these things that you're doing differently that can be a little bit of a payback for you. And as I say, sometimes you have to be creative about that. Sometimes it's a bit left of center. But if you can find those things, those reasons for you why you're investing this effort, it can make it a little bit easier to keep investing that effort when it gets hard. And then the last point there is around supporting the learning process. And so there's two components to this. I've highlighted already how seemingly simple changes have these hidden pieces of learning that are kind of built into them. We tend to underestimate that. So the first part of that is actually taking some time to think through what are the changes in my behavior that are going to be required to make this success. This came out clearly at the beginning of COVID when organizations were switching to these work from home all the time kind of arrangements. I was coaching a lot of leaders at that time who were had picked up their computer, had set it up at home and had expected to just keep working as though they were in the office, and then found that they weren't connecting with people as often as they needed to, or the hours that they were working had kind of just blended into this horrifying 24/7 kind of situation because they didn't have the commute, to bookend their days and force the finish. And so what they needed to do was step back and consciously think through, how is this going to work for me? And what is the learning and changes in my behavior that I need to put in place to make this change successful? So step one, think that through, plan it out. What are the things I need to do and how am I going to do that to make this successful and work for me? The second part is using some techniques to actually make the learning a little quicker and easier. And there's two techniques I want to share with you because they're easy to get your head around and quite effective in terms of supporting and fast tracking learning. The first one is scaffolding. So scaffolding is something that we do instinctively with children and then we forget to do with adults for some reason. So scaffolding is putting some tangible structure around a person that allows them to complete a task successfully before they've actually learned or developed the skill to do so independently. So with a child, a young child who's learning to walk, we'll scaffold that learning by holding the child's hand. And this allows the child to walk successfully before they've actually learned how to do that. This is useful because it reduces those error signals I was talking about. The child's walking successfully, so they're not experiencing mistakes or failure. So they're not getting those error signals, which reduces any stress around the process. And the experience of walking successfully helps fast track the learning and helps get them there quicker. So something that you can do if you've got a whole lot of learning going on is ask yourself, what support or structure could I put around me that's going to help me to do this successfully while I'm still building this habit? And sometimes it can be really simple things. Sometimes it can just be a trigger to remind you to do something differently. So that example I gave before of people not knocking off at 5 because they were working from home. There was a leader I was working with, and he had a tendency to start these really big chunks of work, and then he'd get lost in the piece of work and suddenly look up and it'd be 7 o'clock at night. So he ended up popping a reminder in his calendar at about 4 to remind him to start wrapping things up so that he would stop doing that. And that was an example of him scaffolding that learning. It was just a reminder till he was able to build a habit around clocking off at 5. The second technique I want to talk to you about is chunking and chaining. So this one is useful in terms of breaking the learning down and dealing with that sense of overwhelm if you've got a whole lot of learning that's hitting you all at once. So for chunking and chaining, you would take a particular task that you need to learn and you would chunk it down into the discrete steps. And then you would focus your attention intensively on each step in isolation, practice that up until you've mastered it, and then chain them all together into a complete or discrete activity. This concept is useful because it helps us, as I said, to deal with that sense of overwhelm, but also if we're focusing our attention intensively on a particular step, then we'll learn that faster. It speeds the learning process and reduces those error signals as well. So we can quickly learn each step in turn and then chain them together, in the end, getting where we need to go more quickly. Alrighty, so the next feature of change that I'd like to speak with you about is the fact that change brings with it a sense of uncertainty and can diminish our sense of autonomy. So change by nature is uncertain. We often don't know all of the details of a change or how it's going to impact us or how it's going to work or how long it's going to last for even until very late in the process. And this sense of uncertainty tends to start pretty early and last for a really long time during a change process. So we kind of get a sense pretty early on that something's coming and we don't necessarily know what, which is uncertain, right? And so that will start long before the change has actually occurred, and it will continue for a while after the change has occurred as well, while we kind of don't quite trust yet that it's truly over and that something else isn't going to come left of field and knock us off our perch. And in fact, this pandemic's been a great example of that. We have cities who just get back to some sense of normality, and then there's another outbreak or another strain and we're back into lockdown again. So it will take a while before we're able to trust that this is truly over, which is that pervasive sense of uncertainty. In terms of autonomy, change often occurs outside of our control. So the thing that's driving the change, pandemic, we don't have a lot of control over. And then the decisions around what the change is going to be, very often we don't have a lot of control over. We have premiers and chief health officers, for instance, making decisions on our behalf in terms of how we're going to respond to COVID. And we have precious little control over that, which diminishes our sense of autonomy. So why are these things an issue? If we take uncertainty firstly, certainty and the ability to make predictions is a key mechanism of our brain. It's a key way that it operates, and it's how it manages to process the amount of information that it needs to process at any given time. So there's a neat piece of research that demonstrates this actually. If you measure the time that it takes for a ray of light to bounce off an object in the environment, travel to your eye, through the optic nerve, and then through all the parts of your brain responsible for processing that signal, what we actually find is that people have responded to what they're seeing before the brain has finished processing that signal in its entirety. There's a second follow-up experiment that shows why that's a good thing. And this experiment repeats the calculations, but then also looks at what would happen if you were moving around in your environment at a pretty slow pace. And what they find is that if we waited until we processed that signal fully, we'd trip over the things that are in front of us if we were walking around. So this tendency of the brain to make predictions, it anticipates what it's seeing and then allows us to respond based on those predictions, allows the brain to process stuff fast enough so that we can respond fast enough. There's also a fail-safe mechanism built into this process, and this is the error signal, the ubiquitous error signal. So if the brain finds itself in a situation that is uncertain and it can't make a prediction, it'll generate an error signal, this time in the orbital frontal cortex. The purpose of that error signal is to capture our conscious attention and direct it to the source of the uncertainty. It's the brain kind of saying, hey, I'm not really sure what's going on here. Can you take a look and tell me what I need to do? Now, in a situation like a pandemic, our conscious attention is unlikely to be able to resolve that uncertainty straight away. So the uncertainty will continue and in fact persist for quite a long time, as we're seeing. What happens in that instance is our attention keeps getting captured and keeps getting drawn back to that source of uncertainty. And so this kind of sets up this loop in our head, in our minds, where we want to know the answer, we want to know what's happening, and we can't stop thinking about it, and we can't stop stressing about it, and we kind of go around and around in circles. That process in and of itself can become irritating and stressful for people. The other thing, if you remember, I said about error signals, it activates the amygdala, which we experience as stress. That is happening in this situation too. There is that sense of urgency around this source of uncertainty. And so this whole process of, I have a question that I can't answer and I'm trying to answer it, but I can't, feels stressful for people. And so uncertainty in and of itself can be a source of stress. Autonomy equally is an important need for people, and it plays a really important role in our well-being. So if we're in a negative or stressful situation and we feel like there's something we can do to make that situation better for ourselves, in some way take control of that situation, then we're much less likely to experience detrimental impacts on our health and well-being as a result of that situation. The reverse is also true. If we're in a negative or stressful situation and we feel like there is absolutely nothing we can do to change things, then we're much more likely to experience the detrimental impacts on our health and well-being. If we find ourselves in a situation where we're repeatedly experiencing these negative situations that we have no control over, then we can learn to feel helpless pretty quickly. And once we've learned this helplessness, we become much less motivated to try and do anything to change the situation. We become much less capable of seeing the solutions, obvious solutions that might be right in front of us. And we experience a pretty significant drop in our sense of confidence, self-esteem, and we experience some poor health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. So as you can see, taking someone's sense of choice and control away from them can be quite a significant thing to do to people. It's not all bad news though. There are some things that we can do to make these processes, these inherently uncertain processes that are outside of our control, a little easier to manage. So the first tip on the slide is about being patient with yourself as you grapple with uncertainty and kind of expecting that this is going to be part of the process. So change is inherently uncertain, and what we can find is that there'll be a source of uncertainty. We get an answer for that. We feel better for a little bit, but then actually that answer just opens up a whole host of new questions. And so then we spiral back into this feeling of uncertainty. And that process itself can then be distressing for people. So having realistic expectations around this is going to be uncomfortable for a while, and I am going to feel, agitated, irritated, pick your word, distressed about the uncertainty, and being okay with that can be really useful. It's important not to be distressed by your distress is the point there. The other thing that we can do is look for certainty in other areas. So if there's a change that's occurring, it's inherently uncertain. When is this lockdown going to end is inherently uncertain, and we can't do anything about that. We can't get an answer to that. Something we can do is refocus our attention on things that are more certain, things that haven't changed, things that we can control, and establish that sense of routine, establish that sense of stability, focus back in on BAU, focus back in on the things that are still the same and are likely to remain the same. What this can do is create a grounding, secure base for us that tops up our resilience so that we can then deal with and cope with this other thing that needs to remain uncertain. The same kind of approach works for a loss of autonomy or loss of control. If there is something that's happening that we can't influence, focusing our attention, our efforts on the things that we can control can also be very grounding, provide that sense of safe base, and open up a range of constructive coping mechanisms. A tool that can be really useful here is to look at your spheres of influence, which might be something you've seen before, for those of you that haven't. In any given situation, there's a small number of things that you can control. There's a slightly larger number of things that you'll have influence over, and there's an even larger number of things that you can't control or influence. The things that you can't control or influence are the things that you need to live in peace with, accept, let go of, live in peace with, and instead focus your energy and efforts on the things that you can influence and the things that you can control directly. So it can be useful in situations like this to actually just draw those circles out, concentric circles out, and map out in this situation, what are the things I can control? What are the things I can influence? What are the things I need to accept? And then focus back in on what am I going to do about these things that I can influence and control? This can help you access your agency, access a sense of control. You can do something about the situation from these two inner circles, and it focuses your attention on these more constructive coping mechanisms. Within that, the identifying and testing assumptions piece, when we're faced with a situation that's uncertain, very often what we do is we engage in this scenario planning. So we might go, okay, well, if this happens, then I'm going to do this. And if this happens, then I'm going to do that. And if this happens, then I'm going to do that. That's all fine. Sometimes that scenario planning looks a little bit more like this is going to happen, and then this thing is going to happen, and then this thing is going to happen, and then it's going to be an unmitigated disaster. And the worst possible thing that could happen is going to happen. That's called catastrophizing, but less constructive. If you're catastrophizing, what you're actually doing is making a series of assumptions about things that are going to happen, and all of those things would need to occur in that order and in the time frame you're assuming for the catastrophe to come about. If you notice yourself doing that, and instead you're able to go, okay, let me look at these assumptions that I'm making in turn, and then let me see, is there some information that I could gather about each of these assumptions to find out how likely they are? Then you're, again, engaging your agency. It gives you something constructive you can do. The information that you gather might help you with some more realistic scenario planning and therefore provide a sense of certainty. So this can be a useful reframe if you find yourself down this catastrophizing path, because let's face it, we all do it. Alongside the scenario planning, the other useful thing you can do if you're stuck in this worst case scenario headspace, it can be useful to go, okay, well, I've imagined the worst case scenario. So what's my contingency plan? What am I going to do if that happens? And come up with a plan for how you would respond to that situation. The idea here is that you're then able to say to yourself, well, if I know that I will be able to manage the worst case scenario because I've got a plan for that and I know that everything's going to be okay, then I also have some assurance that I can deal with everything in between. And so I've got some assurance that actually this is going to be okay. I've got some resources that I can use here. The last point there around reminding yourself of times of uncertainty in the past is about, we tend to put a lot of credit or salience on the situation that we're in currently, and we tend to imagine that it's going to last forever, and we can sometimes make it bigger or seem bigger than what it is. If we're reminding ourselves of similar situations that we've been in the past, this can be helpful for reminding us that that situation worked out okay in the end. but also, and more importantly, it can remind us that there were some things that we did in that situation that were helpful and that helped us bring about that successful outcome. And those are things that we could pick up and use in this current situation. The last feature of change that I want to talk with you about is the fact that change involves loss. So all change involves a loss of some kind. We usually have to say goodbye to something. Sometimes that change is, that loss is obvious and salient to us. So people might lose roles or relationships, their sense of who they are, sense of status, things like that. And sometimes the loss can be a little bit harder to identify or even seem a bit misplaced. So if we return to the story of my uncle, for instance, he also experienced a sense of loss when he went through the change to a more healthful state of being. And that loss was hard to get his head around and hard to accept because it felt a bit misplaced. He felt like he was being ungrateful. And the sense of loss for him came with the loss of his wheelchair, which again was, baffling to him. But what had actually happened was one of the ways my uncle coped with his condition previously had been through the use of humour. And the wheelchair had become a really important tool for him in that humour. And so it had all become part of how he saw himself. And it became a part of himself that he valued, that he was able to take this humorous approach to his situation, which was really quite challenging. And then when the wheelchair was gone, it felt to him like a piece of himself had gone along with it. So it's important to recognize that even in positive change, there can be this sense of loss, and that the sense of loss can sometimes be a bit hard to get your head around or name. So in dealing with this loss, what can you do about that in terms of looking after yourself and others? The first point I want to make is that there is no correct or typical way to process loss. If you research loss, you'll find, graphs and stages of grief and things that are supposed to talk about the order that you go through loss. It's not always helpful. People will approach loss in a range of different ways, and actually there isn't one way that's been shown to be better than the others. It's important that you are able to approach loss and process it in a way that is useful and meaningful to you. Having said that, some things that can help is naming, unearthing, naming the thing that you've lost and allowing yourself to say goodbye in some way. An example of this was a gentleman that I was coaching a little while back through a change in his career. And he was about to start this new role, which was more senior than the role that he was in before. It had a whole pile of things about it that he was really excited about. It's a greenfields role. The type of work was amazing. He was going to get better work-life balance out of it. So it was all looking like roses. And yet there was a sense of loss for him as well that was hard for him to get his head around. So we unpacked that together. And what had happened was the organisation that he was leaving was a very well-regarded organisation in his industry. It had an amazing reputation. And the one that he was going to was a little bit of a new player, a little bit of an unknown entity. And so for him, there was a loss of status in going from an organisation that was so well-regarded to one that was, a little bit more neutral. Getting to a point with him where he was able to name that, to be able to say, that's what's missing and that's what's making me feel that way, was actually enough for him to then be able to let go of that feeling and to feel positive about the transition. So sometimes just being able to name that thing that you're losing can be really helpful. Sometimes though more is required, which is the sense-making point on this slide. So neat piece of research I was reading recently shows us that one of the things that people do when they're processing a loss is they're making sense of the story and coming up with a story about how my life was before the loss that's occurred and how my life is going to be now. So one of the really important processes that we do is talk through loss and talk through our experience of what it means for us. Two important points about this. The first is if someone's trying to speak with you about something that they've lost, very often you're tempted to try and solve that problem, to fix it for them because you care and you want to make it better. But actually a more helpful thing to do is just to listen, because very often what they're trying to do is work out what this story is, how they're making sense of their experience. Second point is, if it's you that's experienced the loss and you're looking for that source of support, it can be helpful to start the conversation with, hey, I just want to talk this through. I'm just trying to make sense of it. Don't really want some advice or suggestions. I'm not really looking to fix this. I actually just want to talk it through and make sense of it with you. So are you okay to listen with me through to the end? So that's about all I wanted to talk with you about this afternoon. Just quickly summarize those key points, and I'll pause for a couple of questions. So the first point is that you do have the resources you need to adjust to change, to this change, to the next one, to even bigger changes still. It's not necessarily going to feel like that though. Change is challenging and can be painful for people and brings about real loss. But there are things that you can do to make the process a little bit easier for you. So some of those is managing the fatigue that you'll experience. So get some sleep, go for a walk, spend some time in nature, build the motivation, be creative, try and find the thing that's going to make all this effort that you're investing worthwhile for you. Support the learning, be aware of how much learning you're doing, and have a look at some things that you can do to put some support around yourself as you go through that learning process. Creates a sense of agency and certainty for you wherever you can. So focus your attention on the things that aren't changing. Focus your attention on the things that you can control and influence. Use some contingency planning to give you that sense of confidence that this will be okay. And acknowledge and name the loss that you might be experiencing during the process. So that was all that I wanted to share with you this afternoon. So I'll stop my screen share so that we can have some questions.
Hello, Kelly.
Hello.
That was fantastic. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed this. I do have some questions. We had a comment just when you were talking about your Uncle Paul, beautiful story. Yes, beautiful. Was this what sort of encouraged you to go into this field of understanding change in humans, their brains?
Yeah, it totally was. Like, I don't think you can watch someone that you care about go through something like that and not be impacted by it. So yes, I would have to say the reason he came to me at the party with the book was because I was already studying psychology and I was already studying neuroscience because I've always found it fascinating. So that's why he sought me out. But yeah, definitely it's continued that passion that I've had from there, definitely.
Amazing. Some observations. I've been working from home for 8 months now, and you are totally right. You have to schedule things like sleep in and breaks and lunch, because otherwise you don't have that routine. And that was something I was struggling with this year. But yes, I'm pleased I was on the right place. Scaffolding and chunking and chaining is, I think, such an important thing for us to learn as well. I'm about to employ a small team, and we're going to have to train them remotely. So this is one way that I'm sure that I'll be able to utilise it in mine. What do you think about New Year's resolutions?
Wow. So what can I say about New Year's resolutions?
It struck me as something that we don't plan for, clearly.
No, so I think the answer is it depends, right? So New Year's resolutions would be like all of the other changes to our behaviour that we try and bring about. And I think if you do it well, which is thinking clearly through about what's in it for me and why I'm doing this, and that why is usually a harder question to answer than it seems, but also think through that learning that's involved. What does this actually mean, and what are all the individual steps and changes in my behavior that I'm going to need to pull off to make this successful, and how will I do that? Then you can set yourself up for more success than what we tend to experience. Yeah.
I will go to the gym. Natasha's written, as a leader, how can I support my team going through and accepting change?
Yeah, great question. And some of the strategies that I've mentioned in this presentation actually translate to others as well. So particularly around the uncertainty and the autonomy, focusing them back in on things that aren't changing, focusing them in on that BAU, the rhythms of working routine, can create that stable base. talking with them about their spheres of influence. So, there might be all this stuff that's happening that they can't control, but helping them to work through what they can and what decisions they can make and how they can influence things can be really helpful. Talking with them about what they're losing as well, or where the sense of loss might be coming from for them, can be helpful. So a lot of the tips I've talked about that you can use on yourself, you can equally use on others.
They like your haircut.
Oh, thank you.
Even if it feels like missing a limb. Yeah, I'm 12 weeks and I desperately need one now. What else do we have? So many great takeaways I can use straight away. What was the name of the book you mentioned that your uncle read?
So the book is by Norman Doidge and it's called The Brain That Changes Itself. He has, for your interest, also written a sequel. So both books take you through case studies on neuroplasticity. Well worth the read.
And Sebastian writes, the biggest resistance to change for him was always fear. And I think with many things today, you explained why this is, but could you touch on fear in relation to change?
Yeah, I think so there's certainly that fear of the unknown that would come from change, which ties very closely into the uncertainty stuff that I was talking about. And certainly that amygdala hijack, that thing that we experience as stress, can be experienced as fear as well. Like it depends a little bit on our individual interpretation of it. The other thing that can make people feel fearful about change is the learning that's required. So the other aspect of that is we might go from performing a task or a role that we're pretty good at, that we can do reasonably effortlessly, and now we've got to start again, and we don't know whether we can do that yet, right? Because we haven't done it. We don't know whether we're going to be as good at it as we were before, and so that can genuinely create that moment of, oh, I'm not sure about this and I feel really uncomfortable about it. So yeah, definitely fear can play a really big role for people through this process.
Should we stop watching the 11 a.m. press conferences?
What a question.
Yes, I think we should.
Yes. So look, information seeking is a really important and really constructive coping mechanism for dealing with change, right? So it's one of the things I talk about with leaders actually in facilitating a change in a workplace. What will happen is people will ask the same question over and over and over again, and leaders can get really frustrated with this. And so what I'll say to them is try not to. Because when people are asking these questions, what they're doing is seeking information, which is a constructive way of dealing with uncertainty. So the press conferences are useful because it tends to be the source of the information. I won't necessarily say truth, the source of the information. What can sometimes be a little less helpful is spending a whole lot of time reading some of the more opinion-based information that comes out on social media. So we will seek information when things are uncertain, and you absolutely should do that. Be critical of the information that you're taking in, because the information that you take in can change your perception of the situation and can create a reality for you that's sometimes harder than alternative realities, if you like.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Melissa's written, can you apply these tools to help deal with change to all other aspects of your life? I think I can answer that, yes.
Yes, you can, yes. Absolutely. It does apply to change in general.
Yes, that's very good. Well, that neatly brings us up to 6 o'clock, and this has been an absolutely wonderful and informative session. We'll send that information about the brain that changes out to everybody on the call again, just so that they've got it. Kelly, I'd just love to thank you again for making the time to sit with us today and to impart your knowledge to us. It's been a thoroughly interesting session. If people want to reach out to Trevor Roberts, please, they can go to myself or Petra. We've got your contact details. But on behalf of the alumni and everybody who's typing madly in the comments now, thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you. And everybody, we'll see you in a couple more weeks with our next round, our next session. So thank you all again.